1993 was a landmark year for PC gaming. In March of that year, Intel released the first in its Pentium line of processors, CD-ROM drives had become more affordable, and for the first time PCs had begun to overtake their contemporaries like the Amiga for gaming. id Software's Doom was released, and suddenly every kid without a PC at home was desperate to get one. During the early 90s, LucasArts, formerly Lucasfilm Games, were pioneers of PC gaming technology. In 1993, LucasArts went into overdrive, releasing several games that would enter the PC Gaming Hall of Fame. 1993 was a treat for Star Wars fans and invited players to step into the role of a Rebel Alliance pilot, with Rebel Assault and X-Wing. LucasArts were also at the forefront of interactive storytelling, having already solidified their place in point-and-click adventure history with games like Maniac Mansion, Monkey Island and Indiana Jones. In 1993 they released two graphic adventures, both of which are arguably the pinnacle of the point-and-click genre. Sam & Max Hit the Road, and a sequel to Maniac Mansion, Day of the Tentacle. Today we'll hear from some of the team behind the game and its voice cast, and find out how one of the most perfectly executed graphic adventure games in history was made. I'm on a retro tip, and this is the making of Day of the Tentacle. A sequel to Maniac Mansion was first planned by Ron Gilbert after finishing Monkey Island 2. When he left LucasArts in 1992, he suggested that the reins be taken by Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman. This would be their first project as leads, having cut their teeth on the first two Monkey Island games under Ron Gilbert's leadership. Taking on an equal role, the names appear in random order during the credits and then in reverse during the end credits. While still small by today's standards, Day of the Tentacle had a larger team than Lucasfilm's previous adventure games. There are around 18 people involved, including Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman as design leads. Larry Ahern as lead animator. Larry learnt animation working on Monkey Island 2 and went on to animate for numerous LucasArts games. Peter Chan as background artist. Peter did background art for Monkey Island 2 and has gone on to have an extensive career doing art for games at LucasArts and beyond, and in TV and film. Jonathan ACKLEY is programmer. Jonathan programmed for several LucasArts games after Day of the Tentacle and was co-project lead alongside Larry Ahern on 1997's Curse of Monkey Island. The pair also went on to work together at Disney World, creating interactive attractions. There were also other programmers and animators, including Carl Boulder, who we'll hear from later, who went on to work in film animation at Industrial Light and Magic, Pixar and Illumination, where he's directed several hugely successful films, including Minions. And of course the composers, Michael Land, Clint Bajakian and Peter McCONNELL, three legendary LucasArts composers coming together on this project. All three have since had very successful careers in video game music and sound design, and had all previously worked together on Monkey Island 2 and Fate of Atlantis. So an impressive roster indeed.
Really focused. A bunch of talented young people all focused on just making games. It was a DOS game. So if you ever wrote a bug, you had to reboot the machine, which would take, 5 to 10 minutes. When I started at LucasArts, I had the fastest computer in the building, which was a 4666.
In hindsight, it's like, I've never worked on a project that went as smoothly as Day of the Tentacle. And I think you've probably heard that from other sources. Like everybody said, it was sort of that sweet spot where everybody that worked on it had worked on a couple games before, so we kind of knew how to do them. We had some new bells and whistles with the technology that allowed us to do some new stuff. We got to do bigger, better animations and characters. So it was sort of like plussing up what we already knew how to do. but it wasn't so wide open that you could do anything and be kind of paralyzed by that, you know, anything goes option. So it's like, oh, we can do cooler things. We know the kinds of things we want to do. We all had something in mind, and we put it together, and the game wasn't so open-ended that we ended up getting in a crazy, you know, death march crunch to finish it, because it's like, again, there were limitations, so there's only so much you could do with it. It's like, this is as good as this gets, let's make it good and then move on. And the team was small, which makes a lot of the production problems go away. When you have fewer people, you can just talk to the person working on the thing, you know, whereas you get a team of 50 or 100 or more people, and it's like, then you need middle management layers and, you know, detailed lists and, you know, all that, because people can't just collaborate, you know. I mean, a lot of that was like, I turned to the person at the desk next to me and go, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we did this? You know, oh yeah, let me work on that while you're doing this.
What was initially Maniac Mansion 2 morphed into its own game under Tim and Dave's guidance, becoming Day of the Tentacle, a play on Day of the Triffids, with Maniac Mansion 2 being relegated to subtitle.
You know, I don't remember specifically. I kind of remember hearing the phrase Day of the Tentacle and just thinking, what the heck is that? Like, just remember thinking it was really weird sounding, but I don't remember much more than that.
They were first calling it Maniac Mansion 2, which is technically what it is, but and then Day of the Tentacle was like, yeah, it's very Tim-esque title.
Tim and Dave had programmed and written for the Monkey Islands and were well versed in using the SCUMM engine, which of course was written for the original Maniac Mansion. So they had all the tools they needed going into this project, and their signature sense of humour was perfect for Day of the Tentacle.
Did you see that guy?
I hear he's one of our new SCUMM programmers.
A new SCUMM programmer?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Well, they were great. I mean, I think Day of the Tentacle is if I were, you know, going to point somebody to say, I need to learn how to do puzzle design, I would point them to Day of the Tentacle, because the puzzles are just a clinic. Tim was mostly focused on writing the dialogue. So the person who was generally, you know, managing the unruly programmers was Dave. But they were both great and very, very, very funny. And they tended to be hands-off unless they found something that you had programmed or written in that you didn't like, in which case it would come back from the next merge and it would just be gone. You're like, okay, I guess they didn't like that one. But just fantastic guys and pretty inspirational. I think it was only possible for us to contribute the way that we did because the game design was so solid, right? We didn't have to go to them every 5 minutes and say, what did you mean by this? It was just all very, very clear, which is saying something considering how convoluted the puzzle tree is on Day of the Tentacle. So, you know, their ability to both do the design and then communicate the design is really, really amazing. So I learned a ton, both of how to program and how to design games from Tim and Dave.
I think, well, we worked with Dave recently, and it's pretty much as it always was. His feedback is it's few and far between, but very valuable. Tim, I've always found, has led by example more than directive. So I've done a lot of work with Tim, and somehow you know what he wants without him saying it. That's kind of hard to explain, but I think very, very little in the way of well, can you do this or can you do that? But Dave is certainly a man of few words when you talk to him, which makes the words he says way more when he says them.
I think, you know, all the project leaders that we worked with there, maybe with the exception of Hal Barwood, who really knew his film score and film production techniques really well and could articulate with specificity what he was looking for a lot of times. But most of the other guys, you know, Ron Gilbert, Tim and Dave, would, you know, maybe they would speak up when something, you know, didn't fit the gameplay appropriately or didn't fit, you know, sort of the logic or the vibe or the plot of the game. But that typically wasn't the case. Usually we were pretty tuned in, and we didn't get a lot of guidance from those guys, but we did get a fair amount of encouragement and just sort of a lot of synchronicity with just sort of understanding their point of view and kind of what they were going for, and then we knew how to translate that into music. I think that was generally how it worked.
And to add to that, we got the humor, we got the vibe, and so we would do a take on it that may stretch the chord a bit. It may stretch where we're taking the liberty of being satirical in some way and trying to plant a stake in the ground that's our own, that's like trying to be funny in our way, that is connected, and it may be a bit of a stretch, but the reality is they love that stretching. They love that stretching. They want their composers to stretch. I think in a way you could almost express, and maybe this is a bit of a dramatic way to express it, but it could be true to say this, that their worst nightmare in a composer would be someone who kept coming to them looking for what they wanted and trying to figure and trying to get them to articulate what they wanted, trying to please or trying to slot their music into the situation as they best understood the situation. When they see that one of us has planted a stake in the ground that stretches, that does some sort of cartoony or satirical take on it, they're all too happy to just let it go. And yet, yes, as Michael said, and Peter, when they do call you on something, which is few and far between, but when they do, it's always important. They're always pointing out that somehow you've missed the dramatic mark. Somehow it's going against the emotional play that they're going for. And it's always wonderful to receive that from them. And the revision is always extremely easy because it's so clear. Their communication is so clear, and it's so clear how you miss the mark and how you can now hit it. So that's what it's like working with those guys, is basically they appreciate when we stretch it.
Day of the Tentacle would look very different to its predecessor, as 6 years had passed since the original's release. It would be a departure from the pixelated look of previous LucasArts adventure games, having a more cartoony style. A natural fit for this cartoony style was a Looney Tunes Chuck Jones aesthetic. The central core of the game, time travel, was suggested by Ron Gilbert. He passed on his outline for the game and was around in the early stages of planning, but the rest is all Tim and Dave's brainchild. There's a 200-year gap between each of the 3 time periods. The decision was made to focus on American history in the past and the effects that changing events would happen on the present and future. Many well-known historical figures would feature in the game, including several of the founding fathers. This version of history was of course embellished for comedic value, so they played fast and loose with the specifics. For example, I doubt the US Constitution had a suggestion box.
Boy, it's sure quiet in here. I wonder if there might be any ideas worth discussing in the suggestion box. Maybe somebody should take a look.
No, it all happened exactly like that.
As for the accuracy of the future, in which tentacle overlords rule the earth and humans are kept alive as pets, only time will tell. For Day of the Tentacle, the team were keen to agree on an art style early on, in contrast to games like Monkey Island 2, where some artists came into the project later on, resulting in a less cohesive style. The art style had to fit the Looney Tunes concept, and Peter Chan's backgrounds were a huge factor in setting the tone for the game, not just with the art style, but also with the music.
Yeah, he's a genius. He's just a fantastic artist. And yeah, a lot of subtle humor from Peter.
Peter used some Chuck Jones source material as inspiration for the backgrounds. He sadly wasn't available for an interview, but we can hear about it in this excerpt from the Day of the Tentacle remaster commentary.
I remember when I was trying to figure out and come up with the style, it was back in those days we didn't really have Google internet search stuff. So, all we had were 2 books that I studied from, and that was a Bugs Bunny book compilation kind of thing, and Chuck-a-Muck, which was Chuck Jones's bio book. And I remember to do research, we had to use VHS tapes. And we watched all those classic Saturday morning cartoon stuff, and we would pause. That was how I was studying and trying to come up with, shapes and just study layout. And then, it worked out.
There's a wealth of concept art available, which shows Peter's process creating the game's many varied backdrops.
It was challenging. I remember to accomplish the assignments on time, I remember I had to do the roughs in a day, and then walk it across the parking lot. The next day I did a marker illustration of it, and then the following day was to scan it and then fix the illustration. So I try to get, a room done like every 4 days just to stay on schedule. The reason for the way Day of the Tentacle looks is because of Monkey Island 2 and how it translated, and how technology back then just mutilated my illustrations. And so for the next round, I knew to overcome that challenge was to simplify the backgrounds so then I could eliminate most of those floating pixels. It was a lot of work because once I scanned it in, I had to clean it all up. So I chose this very paper cutout kind of simple to make it look like it was supposed to be this way, that it was supposed to be clean. Again, that was a challenge for me because I love perspective and proper perspective. And so for this game, I was fighting myself every day just doing this. But, I knew, in the end it was going to be okay because that was what we chose to do together.
Peter also drew the box art for the game. Set 5 years after the events of Maniac Mansion, the story sees Bernard return to the mansion.
Back to the mansion!
Bernard is the only returning playable character from the original, chosen for his quote unqualified nerdiness, this time accompanied by two friends, Hoagie and Laverne. Hoagie was based on a Megadeth roadie that Tim had met, while Laverne was inspired by one of Dave's ex-girlfriends. Larry Ahern was lead animator on the project.
I want to say there was only 3 or 4 of us animating at the time, so it wasn't a huge team. It was just a lot of I think I did maybe about a third of the animation in the game, and then had a bunch of other people that were working on other scenes. And back then it was I think technically my title was lead animator. It eventually evolved into animation director. As the teams got bigger, then you kind of had to plot out stuff a little bit more. But back then I think it was more like I was the lead in that I had sort of set the direction and set the style. And then when I was, doling out animations to other people, it was more like, well, here's the character, here's the idea for the scene, this is what the puzzle needs to do. I was thinking this might be funny, but if you have any ideas, that'd be cool too.
Larry had very little animation experience prior to working at LucasArts, learning by animating for Monkey Island 2.
At that point, it's like, well, Ron desperately needs help on Monkey Island 2. And I'm like, yes, I finally get to work on that. And at that point, it was like, well, yeah, but you have to do a test, to see if you're going to fit on the project. So Ron came in and he said, we got a dog that we're going to do. And that was the jail scene with the dog with the keys in his mouth. That was an homage, shall I say, wasn't stolen from Disneyland. It was an homage to the Pirates of the Caribbean. So he's like, yeah, we need that. Why don't you see if you can do a dog walking animation? I can't remember if I designed the dog or somebody already had art for it. But so I remember just getting the Edward Maybridge sequential animal photograph thing. That was the kind of reference we had laying around. Here's frame by frame to see how a horse runs or a dog walks or whatever. So I looked at a bunch of that stuff to figure out how to do the animation of the dog walking, and did that, and then did a couple of things with the keys in his mouth and that kind of thing. And Ron liked it, so said, okay, you're on the project. And then I ended up, most of the stuff I did was actually Guybrush and LeChuck scenes, because Steve Purcell, I think, did a bunch of the more heroic moments, the main story moments, and, you know, the animation for those main characters. But he was also doing a bunch of the background art, and I think he had other stuff going. He painted the box cover, all that kind of stuff. So it was more like, okay, we need someone to backfill Steve's work, because there's a million Guybrush animations. So I did a bunch of goofy stuff for that.
The Looney Tunes vibe of the Day of the Tentacle allowed Larry to take the animations further into slapstick territory than Monkey Island.
So I will say that as I was doing a bunch of the Guybrush animations, I kept like playing around with, like if I was waiting for an assignment from Ron or whatever, I got time to kill, I'd do something like I had an animation where an anvil dropped on Guybrush's head. And then I had another one, I think that one was just me goofing around. But there was another one that was actually in the game where Guybrush steps on a rake and it hits him in the face. And I forget, the actual version of that was a little more tame. I think it hits him in the face and he goes, whoa, or maybe he falls, I can't remember. But of course, the first version that I did, it hits him in the face and all his teeth fall out. And Ron kept looking at this stuff and he's like, yeah, that's too far. You can't do, that's not Guybrush. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but it's fun. I want to do this kind of thing. So you could tell this was the stuff that I was pushing for. So when we got the chance to do Day of the Tentacle, talking to Tim and Dave, Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman, it was like, we should do that kind of stuff, you know, because it's like we had the original Maniac Mansion that we were looking at, and we're like, yeah, you can't really take anything from that because that technology was years back and they were so limited in what they could do. They really didn't have an animation style. You could barely just have the characters walking around like that, a two frame walk cycle. So like, we need a style, you know, let's do like Looney Tunes. So they're like, yeah, that sounds fun. So we started exploring that, and Peter Chan started looking at a bunch of the Chuck Jones. Maurice Noble was one of the background artists that worked on a lot of those Warner Brothers cartoons, the Bugs Bunnies and that kind of thing. And so Peter started kind of saying, all right, what if I took the mansion and did it in that style? And then I started doing some character designs. And it's interesting because at the time, a lot of the most recent games had smaller characters, and I'm not sure if that was like, again, a technology thing. Like if the characters are a little smaller, then we can do more frames of animation, because there was always memory issues you were butting up against. Because in hindsight now, I look back and it's like, well, Zach McCracken and the first Maniac Mansion actually had bigger characters and they had bigger heads, but the Monkey Island games and Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, some of the more recent ones, they were all smaller. So the characters just had little black pixel dots for eyes. And I was like, I want them more expressive. So I want to go back to the big heads thing. So that let me kind of get expressions on their faces, and you could see the whites of their eyes with some of them. Hoagie, you couldn't see his eyes at all, but you know, it allowed us to kind of get expressions to the characters. I'm like, that's what we need. So when the characters are actually doing stuff, they can have goofy looks on their faces. So I think I did, I mean, the character designs all started on paper. So I think I did the first, probably started with Bernard, and then did Hoagie and Laverne. The challenge there was like, okay, this is the concept on paper, but that was the early days when we had just gotten scanners and we're figuring out how to use it, but the resolution we were working in was still so chunky. It's like you take a character that's that small, I'd scan it in and you could get the silhouette, but like all the detail in the face was just pixelated mess. You had to start all over, but at least the scan would give me the proportions of my drawing, and then I kind of had to rebuild it from there. The good thing was, because we were going with the Looney Tunes animated style, then, you know, the characters weren't going to have a lot of detail. It was going to be flat color. And then I was trying to kind of give it a look of having an outline like an animated show would have. And you can do that in some parts, and other areas of too much detail, you kind of have to leave it out. But that was kind of the approach, you know, how do you rebuild it in pixels now to have the same feel as the drawing? And And it's interesting because I go back now and I look at my concept drawings for the character designs, and like a lot of times you'll see games and you'll see like these gorgeous paintings, you know, this is what this is what we envisioned for the characters, and then you see what ends up in the game. You're like, yeah, I can kind of see that, but that art that you started with, that was the thing. I wish it looked like that. And mine, like all those early games, I didn't spend that much effort on the thing because I'm like, the pixelated game version is gonna be a whole separate piece of art that I'm gonna have to do. Why spend all this time doing? So a lot of my concept art or character design art was pretty scrappy because it's like, I'm just trying to get the vibe. I gotta build it in pixels, or, you know, it's kind of wasted effort. So on the other hand, now I look back and it's like, it would be nice to have a beautiful painted version of the thing. I never bothered doing any of that. Like Peter Chan always did these gorgeous concept, you know, color concept pieces, but the backgrounds translated a little better into pixels than the characters did. So I never did a heck of a lot on those, but it's funny. So now I look back at the drawings and I'm like, yeah, I don't consider the character drawings to be the definitive version. I think the pixelated versions are better. But yeah, it was a blast creating those characters. I think the first one I got going in color was Bernard, and I did a walk cycle for him, and we put it in front of one of Peter's early backgrounds. A lot of projects I've worked on since, you know, you like stumble around and struggle with a couple of different approaches. You know, what should it be? I don't know. Let's try this. Let's try that. You do a million different versions of what the characters might look like until you hit on something. In fact, the next game I worked on, Full Throttle, we went through a bunch of versions, you know, before we got one we liked. But with Day of the Tentacle, I think it was literally like, this is kind of my cartooning style already, and then I'm going to kind of exaggerate, make the heads bigger. Like it was just, I'm going to do the way I cartoon, and I just did it, and they're like, that looks great, you know. So there was like no real conversation about it. It was more just like, if we're designing a new character, what does he look like? You know, my interpretation of Bernard was not really discussed much. It was like, that looks great, let's do it, you know.
The added detail also allowed more elaborate animations, with some wonderfully cartoony set pieces.
Hogue Bernard when the kids get combined. And it's like, oh, and so then I came up with the idea like, well, let's have Dr. Fred pull in the X-ray machine, you know, and do that whole gag where it's like, you guys, you're just, you know, in the same clothes. What are you doing? Yeah, stuff like that. Or the exploding cigar. I mean, the concept of the puzzle was there's an exploding cigar, and then I got to figure out eyes going. But then I'm thinking one of the more elaborate ones was he goes up in the attic and the bed snaps on him. I forget if there was a puzzle where there's something in the bed and you have to open it, but there's a bunch of convoluted stuff, and he falls out the window, and you know, so I got to figure out all the gags and fun animation that would go with all that stuff. And so that was a blast. That whole project was just kind of like that. And it was a lot of like, hey, wouldn't it be funny if we do that? Oh yeah, okay, try that, you know. And then I'd kind of rough out the animation and show it to them, and they'd go, oh, that's great, let's do it, you know. And then I'm trying to think I like the tentacle walk cycle because they kind of lean and struggle, but they got a suction cup, and then it pulls off and there's slime under it, and then it slaps down and sticks. There's things like that I enjoy. Some of the little idle animations, like Bernard, just the glasses sliding off his nose. The tentacle bowling thing, we had the close-up thing where you're bowling at the tentacles. That one was fun because you had 10 tentacles or however many it was. They all have to scatter, but they're doing different things. And that was fun to work that one out. I want to say that was because that was one of the early big, you know, money shot animations we were able to do in a game. So that was kind of a big payoff, figure out how do I do that. And that one I think worked okay because the perspective on it, we had the big hand and the bowling ball at the front end, but it still didn't take up a ton of the screen. And then it disappears, and then it comes in, and the ball bounces, and then it kind of scales off into perspective. And the tentacles were probably not that. I think the foreground tentacles were bigger, but like once you got to the midground, they were probably the same size as the tentacle walking across the screen in a normal room, but it still felt different because it was like a different camera angle perspective than, people are used to seeing kind of that side shot, of characters walking sideways past. So it just felt exciting because it was a different angle, and then I liked the Hogue Vernard reveal animation because that was fun. That had a bunch of characters. It had all 3 characters and Dr. Fred and the X-ray machine gag, and then they all had to climb out of the clothing, figure out how that worked.
Memory limitations were thankfully rarely an issue, but sometimes they were too elaborate for the scene.
So Larry Ahern, who was my partner on Curse of Monkey Island, but Larry was lead animator on Day of the Tentacle. And so we had one room that was always problematic. When you go downstairs and there are the chronogons, and then it's like a 3-panel room, and it was huge, and a ton of stuff went in there, and a bunch of object states and a whole bunch of animations. And towards the end of the project, Larry comes and he's like, I have this animation of the sludge-o-matic, and when you throw the switch, the sludge-o-matic is going to do this amazing animation of squash and stretch machine. It's making the sludge, and it looks incredible. He must have spent a ton of time on it. And it just couldn't, there was no way it was ever going to fit into the room. And so I took one frame of it, and I just animated nasty little square bubbles floating from the bottom to the top and popping at the top. So it went from this professionally animated, gorgeous, dramatic thing to little programmer art of squares rising to the top and popping. It's always made him very sad, which makes me kind of happy.
Yeah, the animation that Jonathan was talking about, that was because the thing was like squashing and stretching and doing all kinds of fun bubbly stuff. And some of the things you work on like that, I think the deal with that one was because it was a background element that was animated, it had a lot more colors because you wanted it to match the detail of the background painting. So like the character stuff you could get more elaborate with because they had flat colors, so there's less data you're pushing around. But anytime something that was part of the background had to come to life, then you're pushing around more data because it had shading and highlights and that kind of thing. And I think that one had all kinds of weird swirly colors in the ooze and the sludge, and then had shading on the little capsule thing that it was in, and then the whole thing on the pipe went up and down and bubbled. And I just had fun with it. And then Jonathan just shook his head and like, we can't do that. So I think he went through and just kind of grabbed the keyframes, the extremes, and made it a lot more poppy. Like, all right, whatever. That's better than the last game we worked on. I won't complain. I think that was the only example. And I think I kind of knew that one probably wasn't going to work, but I didn't care. I wanted to make a cool thing, and it wasn't very time consuming, put it that way. It was elaborate, and it was more like stylistically, this is what I want it to be. It wasn't like I spent days on it. It was a little background animation thing. So it wasn't super time consuming. So that was more of a situation probably of me going, this may not work, but it's not time consuming enough to worry about it. Let me just do the animation that I want, and then we'll figure out if we can make it work or not. Whereas like some of the character stuff, you'd go into it and you're like, we're doing a full screen character thing. Let's problem solve this. Let's kind of plot out and figure out what do we think is possible with it. Like I want to say one of the bigger ones that I'm surprised it worked, but it may be because the action was fast, is the close-up shot of the Founding Fathers jumping out the window. And that was Leela Dowling did that animation. But I want to say that maybe because it was cartoony, like it was fast as they busted out, and then they kind of hung in the air and kind of did a crazy like, whoa, and then they dropped really fast. I want to say like that fast motion thing worked, because I think what happens is it did all kinds of weird tearing and pixelation, but you couldn't see it because it went by quickly. So that ended up just feeling like motion lines or whatever, all the tearing. So it's one of those things like either you don't move a lot and it works, or you move really fast and it works. But if there's something in between, then it just looks like crap. So I don't know if that was something that we did a rough version of to troubleshoot and noticed, oh, that's fine, it goes by quickly. I don't remember. Layla might have been working that out with the programmers on that. And then yeah, but the thing that was a blast there was the fact that we got to do big scenes like that. I think that was the first game where we really got to do those impactful scenes, and we had a couple of close-up scenes with the characters screaming and the tongues wagging and all that stuff. That was like, that was a challenge, because we're like, you can only move, I forget what it was, but it was like, you can only have 25% of the pixels on the screen change, you know, at any one moment. So it's like, how do we make it feel like there's this big full animation happening, but it's actually not moving more than 25% of the stuff? So that was sort of like the tongues wagging were pretty big, but then the faces, they were just kind of shifting a little bit, and the eyes were kind of bulging and whatever. So it's like, it wasn't wild. It wasn't a character moving across the screen or anything huge like that. So we were able to pull that off. Most of the stuff was sort of like, we also kind of got some marching orders on like, well, here's some of the new stuff you can do. We can try this, you know, like I said, don't move more than 25% of the pixels on the screen at any one time, or whatever, that kind of stuff. I think that we got general guidelines for that. And then we kind of picked our moments. What are those big screen moments that we're going to want to do for payoffs? And then we had some dumb things like, what the hell's the guy's name? The mummy, weird cousin, whatever. Anyway, that was just he's dead, so you know, there was no animation on that, but it was still nice to get the money shot of him having won the trophy, you know. So it's like, all right, you get a close-up of that, and he's got the fake lips and he's smiling, so it's just like, and I think it was just a musical flourish, like, ta-da, here he is, and he doesn't move at all, you know. But it was still fun. We figured out what are those close-up moments that we're going to want to do, you know, to kind of have payoffs, because we weren't able to do that in previous games.
The initial plan was to have 6 playable characters from which to choose, just like the original Maniac Mansion. With the art and animation being more complex and time consuming, 3 characters were cut. These would be 2 new characters, New Age hippie Moonglow, beatnik artist Chester, and the third being the punk rock Razor from the original game.
I know originally we were supposed to have 6 characters, like the first game, you know, lots of characters to swap between. So trying to remember, it was those 3, and then Moonglow and Razor, who was also in the first game, and Chester, there you go.
The design for Chester was repurposed as the twin brothers Ned and Jed.
Yeah, definitely. I like that design. And when we had Ned and Jed, I don't remember all these damn names. Sorry. Yeah, I was like, oh, use that for those guys. That was a fun design. And then I'm trying to think. I think Moonglow got reused as one of the colonial era characters, but she had a bonnet on, whatever. She didn't have the same hair, so you could barely tell it was the same character. Might have been Betsy Ross or one of those, I can't remember. And then Razor didn't get used. She was kind of extreme.
A first for a LucasArts adventure was the animated intro, created by intern Carl BALDA.
It's funny, he was an intern at the time. I think he went to CalArts maybe. Anyway, it was an animation program. Like back then when we were doing stuff, it was funny. It's like everybody that stumbled into that job was like maybe a comic book artist or an illustrator or whatever. Like I had no animation background. I had dabbled with it a little bit. Yeah, Kyle coming in and knowing a bunch about animation, we're like, oh, what kinds of things could we do? And they're like, well, what if we do this fun animated opening? And all the previous games always used to be just a lot of still frames of art, you know, thematically related to the game concept. It's like we could actually animate some stuff, because we realized if we kept it to like 3 colors, I think we did. So we're like, it's a nighttime scene. It's just you know, a couple of different shades of blue or whatever it was, and we're like, that is limited enough detail that we could actually do some big animations in the scene. So then I think the idea was just like, okay, we'll do a starting scene with the kids saying we got to go to the mansion, and then it's the crazy hijinks of them getting there. And I'm pretty sure Kyle dreamed up most of that. I know he worked with Peter. Peter came up with the different locations, but I think the two of them mapped that out, and it was just nuts. It was great. That was a project that Kyle worked on, and I want to say that he was like an intern for a short period, so it wasn't like he was around to work on the whole game. It's like, we got Kyle for X amount of time, and let's have him do this because it's a great kind of standalone piece that he can do, and it turned out awesome.
I was finishing my first year at CalArts studying character animation. And actually there was 3 people from ILM and LucasArts games that came to give a talk, kind of an inspirational talk. That was Steve Williams, Eric Armstrong, who were at ILM, and Colette Michaud, who was the head of the art department at LucasArts Games. And they were, you know, also getting everybody excited about a movie that they were working on that was going to involve photorealistic dinosaurs. And that was like, you know, it was 92, I think, 91 or 92, can't remember exactly. But everyone was showing their portfolios, and I was a big gamer as a kid, arcade games, because consoles were pretty rare, or like the kid at school who had the console, everyone would be at their house. So they, you know, showed some stuff from like Monkey Island, some of the other games that they had made, and they were looking for an intern. So I applied for the intern animator job at LucasArts. And that involved actually going there and doing an animation test, like a walk cycle with Guybrush from Monkey Island. And on D-Paint Animator, we're using the Amigas. So, you know, this is very ancient like technology now. But it went really well, and they liked what I did. And it was a paid internship. And so it was very helpful to be able to make some money during the summer, continue learning, and be able to afford another year of CalArts when it was over. But I think one thing that's really interesting to note is I had a blast there, such a great time, learned so much, everybody so friendly and so talented. And they asked me if I wanted to come back and do some more work over my Christmas break for 2 weeks. And to which I was thrilled to have that chance. And that's when I did the opening credits sequence. And that was interesting because they actually shut down for those 2 weeks and everyone had their holiday. But there was a couch that rolled out into a bed in the studio, and I basically just kind of lived there for 2 weeks by myself, and I just worked, you know, probably 10 or 12 hours a day, not because of like crazy deadlines, but just because I really wanted to do the whole credits, and I was super into it, and you know, it was just a lot of fun. So that was, you know, looking back on it, like thinking about living at the studio for 2 weeks straight, maybe doesn't sound so great, but it was really good time when you're like 20 years old. So
during the summer internship, Kyle did several in-game animations.
Summer internship was much more doing, you know, game animation, like in-game animations, like when you know, you punch the clown and the clown like bounces back and forth, and then you eventually like take the knife to it, things like that, or the beauty pageant part of the game. I'm just trying to remember some. I think I did Hoagie washing the carriage. That rings a bell. I'm trying to like go back and pick out the individual animations that I did. but yeah, those were a lot of the things that I did over the summer. Like one of the things I had animated in I guess technically it's still the intro of the game, is the sewer pipes that are like belching out all the chemical waste and everything, and like all the chemical streams. I did all that animation, and this is so different from character animation, because you're not animating something that's thinking or feeling. You're trying to animate something that's like a material or fire, and there's something that's really it really is just like kind of a meditation to do that kind of thing, because you're just like animating like S curves and trying to get like or smoke or anything like that. So it's really refreshing to be able to kind of go back and forth between character animation and VFX. The opening credits was interesting because so Peter Chan did all the designs and all the backgrounds. And so he just gave me all those images, and I would talk with him and Larry Ahern about like, okay, well, maybe the car could go this way or that way. And, people would throw out ideas. And then a lot of it too was just things I found, and on the go. And so and I had just having all the fun with like the lens flares and of the headlights and all that kind of stuff. I think the headlights and the special effects animation of the headlights is such a big part of it. But then I was mostly unsupervised for once I got started in that project. But I think that most of what made the job so much fun is that they had a lot of confidence and trust in me to just kind of run with things. But also like I wasn't coming from any kind of ego place of like, this has to be my vision or something like that. Especially as an intern. But just to be sure to like accommodate anything that they had in mind. But there might have been, I can't say for sure that these are the things that happens, but just to give you an example, like the car going through the fence and the fence breaking. Oh, can I do that? Can I bust this up? Or can I have this as a separate element so I can animate that? Oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Sure, go for it. Definitely working within the layout that Peter had done, not changing that at all. And in fact, I mean, there wouldn't be any way that I could have imagined plussing it, you know what I mean? Because it's like Peter Chan is so brilliant, so it'd be, you're just like happy to have such great material to build something on top of.
The animators, including Carl, were using D-Paint Animator.
A D-Paint Animator, pixel by pixel. So it was a very meditative, actually, way to animate. So, but it's actually the opening credits were a little bit easier because it was all in silhouette with just like a little bit of a rim light. If you think about like Hoagie washing the carriage, he has all these colors and everything, so you have to make sure you're animating everything and keeping it on model as best you can. And we would start with, I think I was even using a mouse at that time rather than like a stylus. So I was like using this like basic brick to kind of like rough in the circles of the body and the head and everything and try to get it working. And if memory serves, I think it was, I don't even think that it was like 24 frames per second, which is like typical, and you draw like 12 images to get a second on 2s. I think it might have been like on 4s even. I'd have to go back and really look at it to kind of figure that out. But that, I mean, that's at least the upside of that, is that there's less drawings to do. But just roughing it in, and then most of the time would just be cleaning it up, because we'd all do our own cleanup for that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's just like putting on the headphones and just zoning out and building little colored bricks to make your animation. So yeah, I think it's such a great argument for, like throughout my career, the biggest question that I get asked most by aspiring animators or students has been, what software do you use? And it's always been, that's really not the question. I have used so many different animation softwares throughout the eras, and 3D softwares as well. And the only thing that's never changed is the principles of animation. So that's like, it's what you can extract from the tools. That's all coming from you rather than the machine. So
LucasArts adventures were always littered with references, be it TV, film or other games, and were often references to other Lucasfilm properties. For example, in Day of the Tentacle we can see several nods to Star Wars, Sam & Max, Monkey Island, and many more. The Looney Tunes connection also inspired them to add a reference to Pepe Le Pew, with the painting the stripe on the cat puzzle.
Can't get close to him. This ought to be good.
We can hear a bit on the timeline of the development process from Jonathan and Larry.
Basically, you'd get a design document, which was largely just text in outline format, and you'd read through it and you'd wire up the rooms. So generally you could just walk from every room to every room with no puzzles in between. And then you would just start putting in the puzzles with programmer art and try and just get the logic tree to work. And then final art would start coming in. And then you would realize that the approach you had taken was totally inappropriate for the art you were receiving. And then you would rewrite the entire thing. And you would get different types of art at different times. So, you know, the background art tended to come in earlier than the animation. And oftentimes the animation required the background art to be completed before they could do anything with it. And so it would kind of slowly evolve from a black and white sketchy game to a black and white sketchy game with a few colored spots in it. And then it would be a mostly colorful game with a few black and white spots in it. And eventually it would just evolve until it was finally its own thing and, you know, a fully colorized game. And then you would start getting more and more special case animations and it would get more and more active. But largely it was just kind of like, well, here's the design document, you go off and write it.
It's like games nowadays, it's like you also create the whole story structure, and then you know might be scripting stuff or whatever. Back then it was more like they kind of had the story arc and they had the designs for the puzzles, which was, I mean, design and story kind of go together like that anyway. But it was sort of like, this is the basic story outline and the puzzles fit this way. And then they created a location list from that. These are all the places we need, and we know this puzzle needs a reverse camera angle on that location or at a close-up or whatever. So we kind of had that. That was Peter's, you know, marching orders. But then a lot of the stuff that I was doing was like, well, here's the puzzle list and the cutscene list. So you need to make an animation list out of that. But then a lot of what was happening in the scene specifically, the script wasn't written yet. It was just like, Bernard's going to go into this room and he's going to get item number 2 or whatever it might be. And it's a thing. And maybe Tim and Dave had come up with a funny idea, like, you know, there's a chicken on top of it or whatever. I'm not thinking of a specific example. But it hadn't really been figured out. So it's like, I'd look at the list and it's like, well, the animation needed for this is Bernard reaching out and grabbing the chicken or what, you know, and it's like, okay, well, that's not very entertaining, you know. So then the fun thing was, I mean, I didn't get writing credit, but technically I was coming up with gags. It's like, if I'm going to animate this, what's going to make it funny? So I'd go, well, wouldn't it be funny if he slips on a banana peel and then knocks the chicken over and then it lands on his head and that's how he gets, or whatever. That's a terrible example. I wish I could think of a real example from the game, but it was 30 years ago. So
the animators weren't the only ones to inject their own jokes into the game. Although Tim and Dave wrote the bulk of the dialogue, the programmers were able to add their own sense of humour via the interactive objects.
Tim and Dave wanted to write all of the interactive dialogues of the characters talking to each other, which made sense. You know, they were much more experienced and had done a bunch of games before. So they wanted to make sure that the complex character dialogues were done by them. But being the annoying and ambitious young programmer I was, I really wanted to write. And I noticed that unlike most of the games before Day of the Tentacle, these backgrounds had a ton of detail to them. And so I'm like, well, I'm just going to start writing funny examine lines for every object I can write. Like if Peter Chan drew it, I was going to put a box around it and have the characters say something dumb or funny or stupid when you looked at it. And so I think, and then the other programmers are like, well, Jonathan looks like he's having fun. I guess we'll start doing that too. And I think it was us kind of jumping in and adding dumb little jokes throughout the entire thing. It makes the game feel like it has more going on than maybe some of the previous games. A lot of the games, the only objects you could touch were those which had a puzzle related to them. And so Day of the Tentacle to me just feels really full. Full of jokes and full of funny stuff.
Anyway, it was a fun project to work on. I mean, like the weird thing, like I said, all that stuff was just, I kind of figured out how to animate on Monkey Island 2, and then just had all these crazy ideas like, I want to do all this stuff now. It's like, it was a blast to work on. So, and I think, again, like I said, that was at the point where projects were still small enough that you could have a creative influence on the direction of things, in terms of setting the style, designing the characters, but I could also do a good chunk of the actual animation in the game. Like later on, like Curse of Monkey Island, because we had like 10, 15 people animating, and I was trying to plan it and direct the whole thing. But Day of the Tentacle is like, I could do creative stuff, but I could also actually do a bunch of the animation. So that was fun. And you miss that when you move on to bigger projects.
A useful part of the development process at LucasArts were the feedback sessions, which they referred to as pizza orgies, where they would invite friends and family to play the game and of course eat pizza.
Generally what you look for when you do the pizza orgy is you're bringing in a ton of people who don't know anything about the game, and you're just looking for where they're confused. I know some game companies, particularly with puzzle games, are like really happy when you're confused, but we were not. Like the challenge should not be trying to figure out what you're supposed to do. The challenge should be figuring out how to do the thing that you know what you're supposed to do. And so a lot of the pizza orgy was people just saying, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. Nobody's told me, I haven't received any hints. And you would write that down. It's like, oh, I need to write some hints, because we don't want them saying, I don't know, I don't care anymore because you haven't told me why I should try and open that door. And also it was just kind of a fun thing for everybody to get together and do.
One change that came about as the result of a pizza orgy was the order in which the playable characters are used, as we can hear from Tim in the Day of the Tentacle remaster commentary.
And originally you could play all 3 characters right away. And we had our first pizza orgy where we tested the game out, and people were like, oh, there's so many options, and they're overwhelmed. So now we unlocked it, so you have to play as Bernard for a little while, and then you do something that makes it so you can play Hoagie, and then Vern's the last.
Of course, the SCUMM system and its associated tools were instrumental in the development of Day of the Tentacle.
The SCUMM system was like great to work in because it was like you just had a little puppet theater, and all the things that you wanted to do to make drama were really easy. Like, oh, have the characters walk around and play animations and say lines, and you didn't have to do any programming.
Sometimes I do stupid stuff and I don't even know why, as if my body were being controlled by some demented, sadistic puppet master.
They'd sort of evolved from tools written for the Commodore 64, and there were certain tools which fortunately after Day of the Tentacle were pretty much jettisoned. But I believe there was an animation tool called Byle, and boy, you had to save all the time because you never knew when it would just decide to lock up your machine. They were purpose-built for making adventure games, and so they were very specialized. They were very good at that. Ron, Eric Woolmander, Brad Taylor, Vince Lee, all tremendous engineers, really focused on making adventure games work on really, really limited platforms. So, like, I believe at the time we were doing Day of the Tentacle, what we called the heap size for a SCUMM game, which was basically how much game memory could be allocated out of what your DOS was. We could only keep like 126K in memory at any given time. And then, you know, you'd have these rooms which were 3 or 4 panels long, and you would try and crush it down to make it fit within this tiny memory footprint. So the tools were really, the tools were all focused on making things work on really limited platforms. So then as games evolved and the platforms got better, we had this highly efficient system that could make even better use of all the resources you had when we were, you know, in the Windows 95 world. So they were, you know, they were really excellent tools. I would say they were not designed to be sold commercially. So the user interfaces were, you know, things where the engineer was like, I need to put in this feature and everybody's asking me for it. So I'm going to throw it in. It works. Moving on to the next thing. So I would say they're not super polished, but they got the job done, and they were better than anything else that was available at that time. So one of the tools we had was a tool called Decay, which was spelled DK, not DECAY, but it essentially did the same thing. We used a graphics format called LBM, and the LBM format did run length encoding, meaning it wouldn't necessarily just save data for every individual pixel. It would say, I have a red pixel and the next 5 pixels are red pixels. So I'm just going to say that's 1 plus the number 5. So if your screen's all red, it's a tiny little file. And that's great. So what Decay would do is it would take a beautiful, pristine work of art and smear it so that it created streaks of color. So we had this nicely thing, and the artist had drawn it really detailed, and then we would like, yeah, it doesn't fit. I'm going to hit it with DK, let's say 5, and it would smear it just a little bit. Like, does it fit now? Yeah, nope, got to make it uglier. Smear it a little bit more. And then you'd go and you'd touch up the parts that needed detail. And you just keep doing that, making it slightly uglier and uglier until you could finally get it to fit within the tiny memory footprint.
A huge part of the feel of the game came from the score, which was composed by 3 giants of LucasArts soundtracks: Clint Bajakian, Peter McCONNELL and Michael Land. In Day of the Tentacle, the music took on a life of its own.
This is not film score. What we've done for those guys is not film score. It is not supportive underscore that is meant to enhance but be a background, unseen, unheard, just felt, right? This is what some of the precepts of true film score are. I've even heard that some film composers say, when people tell me they didn't even notice the music, I know I've succeeded. That's BS in my opinion, but this is true. This is one of the precepts that's out there floating around. If they don't notice my music, I know I've done a good job. Well, okay, fine. So in other words, you're saying your goal is to enhance the emotion in a way that's unseen, unheard. It's ninja. It sneaks in under the lines, and it does this sort of psycho stuff that serves the director and serves the story. Okay, great. But that's not what we tried to do. We tried to actually jump up on stage with them, form another character another element that had its own sort of push and pull effect on the emotional reaction of the player.
And I would just add real quickly to that I think that the sort of outsized role of music in those games has to do a little bit with the technology. In other words, since there wasn't a full soundscape in the games that could be realistic, we just didn't have the bandwidth or the disk storage to have that much sound in the games. The music took on this different role that, especially obviously when there wasn't talking at all, where the music just had to be a more present force in the game. And I think that's changed a little bit over the years as games are more cinematic, but that's kind of the tradition we come from. It's almost, like the organ that's playing in the silent movie theater.
Although they'd worked together on Monkey Island 2 and Fate of Atlantis, Day of the Tentacle would be their first collaborative project as full-time employees.
I was contracted in the spring of '91 and came in when Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis and Monkey Island 2, LeChuck's Revenge were both about neck and neck, and they both needed music in somewhat of a hurry. It wasn't really a crunch, but it was definitely, they were both very timely. It ended up that in '91, Monkey Island 2 did ship and basically hit its dates. So that was the first project that the three of us worked together as three composers. And then the following year, Indiana Jones made it out the door. I was only a contractor though, and I returned to Michigan. And luckily, after getting married and having some other things happen in my life, in January '93, was hired on full time and joined Michael and Peter as three full-time members of the sound department. And I believe when I joined, we all kind of convened for the first time as all three of us full-time employees. I had only been contracting prior, in January of '93. And the project that seemed to be most pressing at that time was Day of the Tentacle.
They then had to decide how to split the score between the three of them.
We actually had a history that started with Monkey 2 of sort of amicably dividing up the scores to the point where even in Monkey 2 there were some that we collaborated on. So some pieces we collaborated on. The Largo music was something that I wrote the main part and Michael wrote the bridge, although I think the bridge came first, if I remember right.
No, I don't. Actually, I think it did. Actually, that's right. I wrote the bridge. I thought that would be the main part, and then you wrote a better main part, and that ended up being the bridge. Yeah.
And then with Indy, there were conveniently three paths: the puzzle path, and the path that you take with Sophia Hapgood, and then the path that you take that's got a lot of action in it. And the three paths is really one of the reasons why Indy shipped later than Monkey 2, if I remember right. And so we very simply divided that game by the paths. And I can't remember. I think I took the one with the puzzle path, but I'm not sure. So we had three paths there. We had different islands in Monkey 2, where we just sort of each took an island. And so for Dot, since there was past, present, and future, it sort of made sense for one of us to take the past, one to take the present, and one to take the future. And so it was, if I remember right, it was Clint past, me present, Michael future.
Well, oftentimes, if I remember, I don't know if we did this on Day of the Tentacle, but oftentimes there would be, even though we would divide up either the geography or the time period or the past, because a lot of times there were three of those, there was often somebody designated as a lead composer. So I think, if I remember correctly, I was the lead composer on Monkey. I think Clint, you may have been on Indy. I'm not sure, and I think Pete, you were on Dot. And usually, the lead composer was the one who sort of would do the main theme, or at least the bulk of the main theme, the opening music. And then that opening music would sort of set the tone for the rest of the score.
There's one thing that makes things hang together a little better, and that is since we were writing for a sound card, right, in the ad lib or the MT32 or the sound canvas, the different composer stuff is, you're not choosing, you're working with a really similar sounding palette. So I think that helped just kind of smooth out the score stylistically?
Yes, in the early days, the technology was extremely limited, and it was what they call the Wild West, and literally the entire game industry, and nobody was exempt from this, that every single day was a new set of problems that a given person had never encountered before. There were collaborative challenges and technical challenges, and how are we going to do this? And things were being solved for the first time every single day. And so there was a great deal of power that resulted from teamwork and collaboration and putting our heads together and trying to figure out how to succeed in when at first glance there was no possibility for success in many cases.
To complement the Looney Tunes inspired visuals, one particular musical inspiration seemed perfect.
We would talk about style, and we would reference films, and it's very typical, called a style guide, or any time that at the beginning of a project, a film or a video game, people talk about what kind of style, what kind of sound, what kind of tone or feel do we want. And we were all pretty unanimous and in sync with Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman on a kind of Danny Elfman, a kind of circus big top oompa 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 comedic score.
Danny Elfman just seemed like the obvious direction, and I think partly it was that there's a lot of darkness. There's a lot of things that happen at night, especially in the present. It needed a vibe that was maybe a little bit edgier than Carl Stalling, or Carl Stalling being the composer of the Looney Tunes cartoons.
It's an interesting, I think, phenomenon that kind of Danny Elfman motoric backbeat or vamp kind of in a tuba or in the cellos and basses or in a bass, almost in a polka-like way or a circus big tent kind of way, be really appropriate for video game music to keep the energy up. And especially if you're going for kind of twisted, nerdy comedy. And then the second thing I just wanted to point out is that Peter, Michael, and I, there's kind of an uncanny synchronization of our backgrounds just in life in general, and the kind of entertainment we grew up with, and the kind of music we like, the kind of movies we like, our enjoyment of zany humor like Monty Python. All of us had a lot in common, coming to the table from three different directions, and found that we could actually work as, no pun intended, a three-headed monkey.
During that time, we were growing the department, and I think it was during Day of the Tentacle that we hired Michael McMahon, who was our sound programmer. So we were interviewing various folks to sort of build up the department, and one of them had been a trumpet player for a band called the Knights of the Oingo Boingo, which was Danny Elfman's band. He was had a bunch of Danny Elfman stories, and one of them, I believe this came from him, was that the original the original on Knights of the Oingo Boingo was the house band for the Pickle Family Circus. So that circus aspect of the big top aspect, which from Pee Wee Herman, that's very much like that's the stuff he did in that gig. Whether we knew that going into doing the score for Dot or not, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, basically, if you bring in, that band was the band for that Pickle Family Circus or something. If we're bringing in kind of a circus oompa oompa thing, again, what we did was not really film score, because film score, you're supposed to support what's on the screen. You're supposed to get behind it and support it. What we did is we added new elements that weren't there. Sure, we were trying to support what was going on, of course, but we were also adding dramatic elements that were somewhat incongruous in some ways, and thereby added to the satire and the entertainment factor when you're talking about Tim Schafer and Ron Gilbert and Dave Grossman zany humor. What we, I think, always try to do is enhance the world with elements that the rest of the disciplines on the project, art, storytelling, dialogue, voiceover acting, all the different elements other than music are incapable of bringing into the mix, i.e., where did this circus big top sort of feel come from? There was no circus or tent in Day of the Tentacle, but it was there actually. That kind of somebody on a tricycle on a high wire was there. It was very hidden and in the background in the form of musical notes. And the same thing in Monkey Island. If there's a pompous character in Monkey Island, we may bring in a harpsichord and sort of parody that character by using a musical instrument. So I think that was it wasn't just a question of style, but it was also a question of trying to stretch the game out in the spirit of comedy and in the spirit of satire.
In the Looney Tunes, the music is, I think, more of a character than it is in a lot of other visual entertainment. And I think in Dot, that was also true, that the music was kind of one of the characters.
Peter Chan's backgrounds also served as inspiration for the music.
I looked at the backgrounds at least as often as I'm looking at the characters. He's really one of a kind.
The puzzles would also factor into the composition process.
A lot of times with the puzzles, it's really important to understand how long you're going to be somewhere, because sometimes things go by pretty quickly, and sometimes you could be there a really long time, and you compose differently for those two cases, and you really have to know which one you're in.
iMUSE played a large part in how the music was composed too. Michael and Peter were co-creators of the iMUSE system, or interactive music streaming engine, which allowed for the seamless transition between different pieces of music. This was perfect for adventure games, where the player would frequently move between areas. First used in Monkey Island 2, it's been used in every LucasArts adventure game since. Day of the Tentacle was the third adventure game to use the iMUSE system, and fourth game overall, including 1993's X-Wing.
Test drive of the iMUSE system, it was kind of a contest between Monkey and Indy as to who would ship first, and basically Monkey shipped first. I'd say it was massive for Dot, especially, probably almost more than any other title, because what we were trying to do with iMUSE and Dot was not only score the interactive experience, but it was coming at a time when the range of quality of playback platforms was quite wide. So someone might have a machine that had like an 8286 processor on it that was super slow, and so the actual cutscenes would play much slower on that. But as in terms of the length of the piece, we actually had to have iMUSE play little tiny chunks over and over again before they go next to the next chunk. We call it accordioning. So literally every single piece you wrote, you were thinking about how it was going to work with the interactive system, because not only were you planning for getting into and out of the situation, or changing the situation as it sort of develops, but you're also thinking about, well, shoot, some poor person's going to be playing this on this terrible machine, and it's got to sound good on an ad lib card.
And then as well as the person for whom their highest goal in life is to have the hottest PC known to man with the hottest graphics card and the highest quality sound card and everything, and somehow they managed to reconcile all of their IRQ conflicts so that they can have a printer and a mouse as well. and this it was this entire culture that obviously from a business perspective, LucasArts needed to make this entertainment product as accessible to as wide an audience as possible. So yes, it's a very good point. Not only was the adaptability being done for dramatic reasons to try to have the musical score change with the drama at the right times, but it was also done to accommodate a very wide range of graphics and processor performance. Effectively, it was meant to behave like film score. It was meant to behave like with hit points and synchronization and all of the ideals that go along with film score. But of course, then you have to jump through all the hoops, and the iMUSE system greatly assisted in that being able to be done, as musically smoothly as possible, given the great variance of machine speed.
iMUSE famously took up an entire floppy disk, but the music itself didn't take up too much space.
Something like that. Yeah, it was about a floppy disk worth of code to do the iMUSE system, which was unheard of in those days for what was called a sound driver. Still in Day of the Tentacle, we were fine really when it came to the memory for music, because we were in the MIDI realm. So MIDI is very compact, and so there were no issues with that. At some point, the only way we were able to get to the digitally streamed music was by leaving floppies behind. So until then, we were in MIDI. But once we left the floppies behind, we were able to go to streamed music. So that was nice.
Like the Byle tool the animators used, the composers had other tools available to them, which were often named after bodily fluids.
We actually had in the theme of the funny tool names, we did actually in the early days create a tool, an audition tool for listening to little sound snippets called earwax. Remember that one, Pete?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's earwax, and wrote something called Q-tip.
And Q-tip, that's right.
They're supposed to clean out earwax. Yeah, no, I do remember that. Yeah. And yeah, you had to, and so I was just going to say just real quick how that worked is in order for us to actually write for our sound cards, we had drivers that Michael and Michael wrote for all the sound cards, and then we had we had a sequencer running on our Mac, which would then go out using it would just go out the MIDI port to a PC, which was running our custom software. And the PC was operating sort of like a synthesizer, except the synthesizer was the sound cards. And that's how we would compose for something like Dot.
In any such situation, other sorts of middleware solutions or audio development and then audio runtime solutions, you're going to have, ideally, and you better have, or there's going to be quality issues, an authoring component and a runtime component. And the authoring component is what the composer or sound designer or audio specialist uses in a studio setting offline from the game. And then the runtime component is the actual engine embedded in the code of the game that basically executes everything that was designed in the authoring phase. And so we needed to equip our MIDI files with embedded messages that then, when those MIDI files were being played back in the game, those messages were being parsed and being interpreted, and when certain conditions were met, like, okay, Bernard opened the door, that it would basically call a hook ID, and when the criteria for that ID was met, the next ID of that description or number or value in the MIDI stream would trigger whatever command was embedded. It could be a jump command. It could be a part enable. It could be a part mute. It could be, you know, a pause all sound. It could be a number of different types of commands that Michael and Peter designed for the iMUSE system to do. We were on a Macintosh with several components running simultaneously that all talk to each other. And these were pretty primitive Macintoshes compared to today's standards. So it was pushing the machine quite a lot. There was a central sort of MIDI hub. And then there was a HyperCard stack. And HyperCard was something that gave a user kind of a high level of ability to create different command structures and functions. And Peter and Michael used HyperStack to basically we would, and then we would have our MIDI sequencer, which was Performer, Mark of the Unicorn Performer running. And when we wanted to put, let's say, a jump hook on every downbeat, we would put our MIDI sequencer into record and onto some track like called a control track or something. We would then go over to our HyperCard stack where we had pre-configured and gone to the page called jump hook, set the value to 17, for example, and then hit send. It would send a sysx message through the internal virtual busing system into the recording track on Digital Performer. And then we would quantize it to the downbeat of bar 1, copy it, paste it to bar 2, paste it to bar 3, paste it to bar 4, etc. Now at every bar, when Tim Schafer or Dave Grossman called, okay, Bernard opened the door, jump 17. But it would basically, almost like a mailbag being picked up by a passing train, it would grab the hook and maybe jump to the transition that then transitioned to a new piece of music.
Yeah, the jump hooks were, you know, kind of the bread and butter, because the jump hook would have a hook number, which was enabled by the game, and then a destination, and that's all it was. But you could do anything with that, you know, because the other thing we would have would be just, you know, unconditional jumps. So you come to the end of one chunk, but it jumps to some other chunk, and, you know, and then we also had random jumps where you would have a jump hook that had 3 destinations, and it would pick one randomly when you hit that hook. So, you know, you could really mix it up with that stuff. And then of course similarly enable and disable, you know, we'd had conditionally enabling and disabling parts. So that was pretty much it. You know, that covered the horizontal was covered with all the different forms of jumping, and the vertical layering questions were covered with the different part enables. And that was actually, you know, you could do pretty much anything you wanted with those, you know, fundamental capabilities. The thing that we discovered really, and I think maybe Dot might have been the last game that we did it in the original way, was that the game side of this equation, the game programming side of this equation, was very high overhead, because you had to constantly be communicating with the game programmers, you know, set this hook when the door opens, okay, and then you know, set that, turn this hook off, if he opens the door but closes the door within a certain amount of time, you know, turn the hook off. All this stuff that was very you know, meticulous, and took a huge amount of interacting with the game team, because they were doing the low level you know, mechanics of all the musical transitions. And so around probably right after Dot was when we said, you know, we need to abstract this. And so that's when we came up with this concept, what we called states and sequences. You know, the current middleware programs call them different things, but a state was something that was a condition that could last indefinitely, and a sequence was something that just happened for a finite amount of time. And everything that occurred in the game that had any kind of musical impact was categorized as either a state or a sequence. And the game programmers then would just we'd have a big list of states and a big list of sequences that the game team would program into the game. And then the composer would figure out, okay, well, when this state goes to that state, set this jump hook, and when this sequence starts, set this other jump hook, and then when the sequence ends and goes back to a state, set this jump, and we could then mock up all those states. And so then we created a tool on the Mac, which was a bunch of basically buttons on a screen that were connected by purely decorative lines, but the lines were really helpful because it could tell you what connected to what. And these things look sort of like subway diagrams. And you could then essentially click around in the Mac and essentially exercise the score the way the game would be exercising the score, and hear how these, which transitions worked well, which ones didn't. And that actually became sort of the main tool we used for the last few years.
What we were solving, right, was an asynchronous problem, a problem where, there's going to be input in from the game, from what's happening in the game, and what input from the user, and that needs to be handled by an intelligent system to make musical changes in a musically appropriate way. So how you distribute where the control is. At first, it was very micromanaging from the actual game script, as Michael was describing, where you had to make all these little calls, and it was prone to bugs, and you actually had to sit down as a composer right next to the guy who was doing the implementing, or the woman who's doing the implementing, and say, okay, now here, do this here. I mean, we spent many hours doing that. And so, but I think our sort of successive versions of solving this problem came from the fact that we both worked at this company called Lexicon, an audio company before LucasArts. And the way that black boxes that musicians play their instruments through, the way they work is they have a host processor and what used to be called a slave processor, a processor that basically is controlled by the host. And so that second processor does all the DSP, actually does the code, constantly running code to change the audio. And the host processor is taking the user input and setting what were called hooks in the second code's code, the second processor's code. And that's how reverb units work and digital delay units work. And so we were basically taking that principle and applying it to a game system. So we were kind of lucky, I think, in some sense, of having worked at in this one environment where we learned this technique of dealing with asynchronous problems, and then could apply it in this totally different situation that involved music itself.
The connection to the film production branches of Lucasfilm served as a great source of inspiration for the team.
That connection to Skywalker was very inspirational for us. So people like Gary Rydstrom, also Randy Tom, who's another sound designer there. Anyway, these guys, we could actually visit their offices, see how they worked. Watch Gary Rydstrom, scoring something and just picking up a microphone and going, and that's the sound. I mean, it's like they're very, freewheeling creative people. And we didn't have, we weren't working in a Dolby surround room like they were, but it was very inspirational to actually watch them do that and then translate that into our little world of 8-bit 11K at the time. So, I mean, you actually got to, even though we were in this tiny niche of a market, because of Lucas connection, we were actually able to learn and be inspired by some pretty major cultural figures.
Michael, Peter and Clint worked together as recently as 2002 when they jointly composed for A Return to Monkey Island.
Dot was the last new game that we all worked on together. The Monkey Islands that followed, we all worked on.
Yeah, Escape from Monkey Island we all worked on. Michael was the lead and only composer on Curse of Monkey Island. And then, of course, Return to Monkey Island we all worked on together.
Another huge part of the cartoony atmosphere was the sound effects done by Ron Baldwin. These too leaned heavily into the Looney Tunes-esque concept.
Ron was one of the programmers on the project. And but I remember doing a lot of the sound editing for that. I certainly did all of the sound effects programming for that. Meaning that took the sound files and put them through the whole thing to try and make it sound like a Warner Brothers cartoon. Yeah, so I programmed all the sound effects, and it was very interesting because the game felt very different. Like I think sound actually, music came probably close to last. And so you feel the game evolve and like it goes to color from black and white to color. It's like, oh, the game feels a little bit different, but it still doesn't really feel alive. But boy, when those sound effects start dropping in, all of a sudden sound it makes such a huge effect of it. It really transformed the game, and all of a sudden the game felt completely different. And when you play the game, there are a ton of different sound effects for just picking up objects. Whip, woo. And so at the beginning of the game feels a lot more lively. Towards the end of the game, you've picked up everything. And so there are just many fewer sound effects. And so I just find that playing Day of the Tentacle, as it gets towards the end, it just doesn't feel as, it just has less sound, and therefore kind of feels more subdued than it did at the beginning of the game. This is kind of something I noticed about the game once the sound effects went in.
Day of the Tentacle was LucasArts' first Talkie release, featuring full voice acting. But this wasn't the plan initially. Originally planned as a floppy disk release, they changed tack halfway through the game's 9 months development, as the success of games like Myst had sold enough CD-ROM drives to make a CD release worthwhile. It was decided that the game would be released in tandem on floppy and CD.
The introduction of the CD-ROM did not alter our approach to sound effects or music. It really was pretty much the same level of constraints. And what was the talk around town and what everybody in the company was excited about was the fact that we could have a full voiceover, what we called a talkie. And it was so fun. And I think everybody loved using that word, talkie.
We called them talkies, and we really enjoyed, in the early days, we actually were able to do some of the voices ourselves, but that was, quickly and wisely taken away from us.
The floppy version couldn't accommodate all the voice acting, which consisted of around 4,500 lines of dialogue. In contrast to the full CD release, the floppy version only had a voiced intro.
We had the really terrible version of the quality for the floppy disk game, which had limited voice. But then there was this marvelous new technology called CD-ROM. And boy, the audio was so much better on that version, and a lot more of it. So I think we had different bit rates for the CD-ROM version. The audio did not sound just as nasty as it did on those floppy versions.
Several people provided voices for the game. Denny Delk, a Lucasfilm voice veteran, voiced several characters including Hoagie, Purple and Green Tentacle, and George Washington.
Is it true about you and the cherry tree? Oh yes, it's quite true. Why, I've cut down acres of cherry trees in my day.
He's done so many voices for Lucasfilm properties over the years, Sam & Max, Full Throttle, Dark Forces, and many other Star Wars games, but many will know him as the voice of Murray from the Monkey Island series.
I am Murray, the all-powerful demonic skull!
Richard Sanders voiced Bernard. He was the one voice actor that the team actively sought out, due to the voice of his character Les Nessman in WKRP Cincinnati, a show from the late 70s and early 80s, which they felt was perfect for Bernard. and to their surprise, he was available.
Oh, yeah. Now I remember. He's incredibly evil, isn't he?
The other playable character, Laverne, was voiced by Jane Jacobs, who also voiced the maid.
Hey, when are you guys going to judge best laugh?
Jane also provided voices for Fate of Atlantis, including the heroine Sophia Hapgood. It seems that Jane didn't act for many years after Day of the Tentacle, but has recently provided voices for Telltale's Guardians of the Galaxy and The Outer Worlds. Ginny Westcott, Tim Schafer's sister, voiced Betsy Ross, and possibly some other additional characters.
Those founding fathers are driving me nuts. Flag design changes every 5 minutes.
She continued to work with Tim, doing voices for several Double Fine games. Peggy Roberts Hope voiced Edna Edison.
Nice try, but I never forget a face. You broke into our mansion a few years ago to save your little friend.
Peggy notably voiced Mon Mothma in a few Star Wars games, including Dark Forces. Nick Jameson, another voice actor that's voiced many Lucasfilm characters, including Max in Sam & Max, Kyle Katarn in Dark Forces, and Emperor Palpatine in numerous Star Wars games, as well as the Clone Wars series. He also does stand-up comedy and music, and was notably a member of Foghat for a time and produced several of their albums. He also appeared in TV shows like Lost and 24. His list of voice acting and TV and film acting credits are extensive. Nick voiced several characters for Day of the Tentacle, including Dr. Fred and his past and future counterparts, Down on His Luck inventor Dwayne, and John Hancock.
Behold, children, the Chronogon!
David Kirk TRAYLOR provided voices for several characters, including Ed Edison, Ben Franklin, the cigar salesman, and Thomas Jefferson.
I tell you, we novelty good salesmen know how to have a good time.
David is another actor that has a long list of acting and voice acting credits across video games, film and television. David, also a comedian, is perhaps best known by his comedic alter ego David Zed, also known as Zed or Zed Robot, and had several shows based on the character. Although he went on to do many other projects, he only provided voices for one other LucasArts game, the Talkie version of Fate of Atlantis.
Well, I was in music prior to that, and I had a rock climbing accident that kind of blew that all up. That's a long story, but I had a friend. I needed to make some money, and I had a friend who did voiceover, and I thought, well, I'll give that a go. And since I had been messing with voices for a long time, and I made a little tape and sent it around to agents in Atlanta, where I was living at the time, and yeah, I started getting work, and I immediately liked it. It's just different from sitting in a studio month after month and hoping your record will be promoted properly. You know, you just go in, you make some noises, you have some fun, and you get paid. You know, and it's also more socially interactive than, you know, working in a studio is all the time, you know, making either my records or other people's records. So yeah, it was more fun, and it was a nice change. I believe it was that one was advertised in the back of Hollywood Reporter, and a friend of mine, whose name I don't recall at the moment, she's a very good improviser. We did improv together. She said, you know, you should check this thing out. There's an ad at the back of the Hollywood Reporter for something they call talkies. They didn't even call them video games or interactive games. Either were early games with voices on them. They called them talkies. And they didn't go through agents. They went in the Hollywood Reporter, which is the last place you would expect, you know, to find that. You know, it's an industry newspaper for professionals talking about, you know, what agent got hired where, and, you know, reviews of movies and stuff. So I checked it out, and I went down and auditioned. In those days, in the good old days, you'd go in usually on a lot of projects, most projects, really, you'd go in, and sometime you would read first at your agents, and then they would, you know, listen to a bunch of people and decided who they wanted to bring in. This one, you know, because there were no agents involved, I just went in. You know, I ended up, of course, paying my agent, but this was something I found on my own. So that doesn't really exist anymore, going in and auditioning, or even a lot of times going in and doing the job. Most auditions for things like that then were you would go in and meet the voice director. Then it became more where you would, as games got more and more popular, there were more and more of them. You would do it from home and send it in, or you would go to the agents and your agent and read in a booth with a booth director, and then they would bring you in if they wanted to hear more, or they'd hire you from that.
I just moved to Los Angeles from Rome because I figured I'd finished a big project for the Scala of Milano, a very highbrow theater tour. But it was clear that, I wasn't going to be allowed to go any further than I already had. And I was getting older, so if I was going to go to Los Angeles and try it, I'd better do it. And that's what I did. But then I got a call back to do, anyway, in Los Angeles, I had a friend from Rome who moved at about the same time, who was a photographer. And in his office, there was a lady waiting, and we started talking. And she said, she had her daughter was doing a play in Rome. I made friends with her, and then she started working at LucasArts. And she, obviously knew I had done dubbing, and I'd done, some video games as well. And she called me, and I auditioned. It was interesting that though, when we did it, the audition, it was at the Skywalker studios in Los Angeles. Now the auditions were done there, but the actual voice work was done in a much smaller studio because they didn't have the budget to work in their own LucasArts studio.
The recordings were done at Room 222 Studios in Hollywood.
Yeah, it was kind of small place. I don't know if they did anything other than voiceover there. I have an idea they might have done music too, but it wasn't a big room. It was a smallish room in the sort of funky part of Hollywood. And yeah, we did a number of projects there. It wasn't one of the big studios, the sort of name studios that later became, or even at the time were like sort of voiceover standards.
Tamlin Barra was the voice director for Day of the Tentacle. She went on to direct the voice actors for many LucasArts games going forward, especially for their Star Wars games and for 1993's Sam & Max.
I believe it was Tamlin Barra, and it was an interesting audition. She would take notes in Italian. She spoke Italian. Her husband was Italian. But we got on very well. And then I came back and did that. And then I think we did Sam & Max Hit the Road right after that. Maybe was the next one. But yeah, we did do a lot of LucasArts stuff, tons of it. Yeah, she was a very good director. I'm sure she still is. And it was really good. She gave good direction. She understood what was going on. She'd done a lot of research, and she knew what the writers wanted. And yeah, it was a real pleasure working with her. I think she did get very good results.
Tamlin's direction was vital for the voice cast to understand the context of each line, especially with the branching dialogue trees typical of point-and-click adventure games.
Scripts don't tell you much. It's just lines of dialogue. You say the same thing 15 times for each line. So it's it's not like reading a TV script or a film script or a play. You have really no idea what's going on. And so the director will walk you through each scene, and sometimes will feed you lines even, stuff like that. You definitely need somebody, giving you the beta on that.
All the voices were recorded solo.
Except, like for Sam & Max Hit the Road, Bill and I worked together. They would record us both together because it was such an interactive thing. You kind of had to.
Yeah, well, so much of doing voices and dubbing as well. You don't, you go in, you do your bit, and you're off to do something else. It's the nature of the beast, but it's also the wonderful thing about it, because you're not sitting in the cold, rainy outback out waiting for the sunshine so that you can take a shot, you know.
As director, Tamlin would influence their decisions with character bios and images, but the final decision on the voice was largely up to the actor.
It depends on the production. And, you know, sometimes it's done a vuoto, or, you know, with no visual input at all. And sometimes it's done, like I said, like you have guys, you know, with the balls on their face, fit it into their facial, and you try to fit also the intent too. Sometimes that can be funny, but you know, it's you know, it's nice to have a little visual input. It's also nice to be doing it like you're doing a real cartoon, which is, you know, you do the voice first and then they animate to your face.
The voice is basically my decision, but I'll base it off the drawings, off the character description, you know, what he does, what his psychology is. And again, because of the nature of these scripts, you know, the director will say, okay, he's a mad scientist with suicidal tendencies or whatever. And all of that will inform me, and then I'll just sort of find something that I think fits that. Or, you know, it's an interesting process. It really is. It's a lot of fun, especially when you're doing a bunch of them sort of bouncing back within the same show. You know, it's a nice exercise.
In the beginning of anything like that, you have a freedom that you don't have once the genre is established. You know, you don't know where you're going, so you're taking risks that you might not otherwise.
Of course, the decision to release a talkie version meant that the programmers would have to accommodate.
Well, what you do is you write the dialogue in what in SCUMM would be called a saline, like saline, Bernard, I don't want to pick that up. And then when the script was locked, I think Eric wrote a system which went in and replaced every saline with a macro. And that macro would look for the audio file appropriately named for the dialogue that had been written. And so when it came time to record the script, the actors would get the script, and the script would have a file name next to the line they were saying. So then when it was recorded, they would immediately save it to the correctly named file. And so all we had to do is, once we got the dialogue files, is we dumped it into a big folder and ran the game and hoped that the files had been named correctly. Most of the time they were, but other times it's like, yeah, there's no, missed the file name for, you know, Bernard Saline 0240 or whatever it was. You'd have to dig for it. You might have to reprogram for timing purposes. You know, it's like when it was text, I didn't have to worry about it, but he talks too long or he talked too slowly, and now this animation happens at the wrong time. So you would have to go in and retime some of your scenes to make them work.
Eric Wilmunder also wrote voice technology for moving the characters' mouths, but at this stage it was quite primitive compared to later iterations.
Eric Wilmunder, he developed a technology that made the mouth move with the waveform. I don't believe, and certainly for Dot, I don't believe that the waveform was being analyzed to the extent of being able to discern between different types of consonants and different types of vowels, such that an O would make the mouth round and a, you know, etc. I think it was just the mouth open, mouth closed, but it moved with the waveform, the audio waveform, and it was tremendous. So I believe that's, I just happened to remember that. Eric Wilmunder developed that tool, and the people in the voice department were overjoyed, and it was really cool.
It just knows audio is playing or audio is not playing. Then we did some lip sync. I don't know if there's more than one scene. the Bernard scene with the close-up where he says we've got to go back to the mansion at the beginning. That one I lip synced.
Back to the mansion.
Eventually we ended up having a lip syncing tool where we could match the correct mouth positions to the sounds of the voice. And then I think at some point it might have even gotten automated where we had a tool that could kind of recognize some of those different mouth positions and how to match them to the sound file. But yeah, early on it was just like it plays when the voice file plays, and it does pretty well. I mean, I look at it to this day and it's like it just looks like a funny cartoon character talking, you know. Because where it really falls apart is if you get into a close-up, then you want to see it lip synced properly to the funny line where they exaggerate something, you know. And that was the back to the mansion. You got to see the right, you know, mouth positions for that.
Another clever bit of programming came from Ahern Giles, who ported Day of the Tentacle to the Mac, along with many other LucasArts games.
LucasArts released Rebel Assault for the Mac, and that was right at the time that Apple was transitioning from 68040 to PowerPC based machines. So they went from Motorola 68000 based machines to PowerPC. And as you know, since they've made this transition several times throughout their history, when they translate to a new architecture, they provide emulation support to run existing programs on the new architecture. And this was their first go at it, and they did a pretty good job. But it wasn't quite performant enough in that, you know, your basic low-end PowerPC could almost keep up with a 68040 or a 68030, but not quite. And the place where it really hurt was in games. So when Rebel Assault came out, it was not written for PowerPC at all. It was only written for 68000. And so what we found was that it ran kind of sluggishly. Those of us who ran on the PowerPC, it ran okay, but it was sluggish. It wasn't showing off our machines. So I decided, as a bit of a hacker, I decided I would hack into the code and see if I could figure out a way to speed it up, because Apple provided a mechanism where you could insert PowerPC code even into older style code and have it kind of switch back and forth automatically. And so I figured out a place where they were drawing to the screen. I said, maybe I can just make this particular function a lot faster by writing it in native PowerPC code, and I hacked it in, and it worked. It made things run much better. So I put a patch up on the internet, and that caught the attention of LucasArts in a bad way and in a good way at the same time. So, of course, their legal department was like, hey, what's going on here? People are releasing hacks to our games. But on the other side, they said, well, this guy seems to know what he's doing. And also the programmer that they'd been using for all their Macintosh ports prior to, up and through Rebel Assault, he was interested in joining the company full time and moving on to new projects. Working on the Nintendo 64 ultimately is what he did. And so they were looking for somebody to replace him and become their Mac guy. So they said, well, this might work out. So they brought me in for an interview. I came out at the beginning of, or late in 1994 for an interview. Flew out to there because I was working in New York City at the time, and got the interview, got the job, and started right at the beginning of 1995. And so they initially put me on, you know, Dark Forces and Full Throttle, which were sort of the big up and coming games. At the time, Mac was all any color Macintosh were 640 by 480 resolution and higher. So our first challenge was that Mac users expected crisp, clean graphics, and of course, Dark Forces and Full Throttle were written for 320 by 200 VGA graphics. And in the past, all the SCUMM games, Eric Johnston, the guy who preceded me as the Mac porting guru, he developed something called EPX, which was a graphics smoothing algorithm. So it would take the pixels of the VGA screen, it would double them to a 4, you know, every pixel became a little 2x2 pixel, but then he'd have intelligence for like filling in and creating diagonals and smoothing things out. And so all his Mac ports had an option to turn on the smoothing. In fact, I think the early ones didn't even have an option. I think it was just always on. And that gave the Mac users a slightly nicer looking display, though, you know, purists these days will be like, well, you should be looking at the original graphics and that kind of thing. But, you know, let's leave it up to the users at this point, I'd say. But so that solved the problem for the SCUMM games, and we applied that same EPX algorithm to Full Throttle and the Dig when we moved on to when I worked on those. So I just pretty much took his logic and updated it for the PowerPC and moved it there. But for Dark Forces, that was a new engine, and the Mac users were not going to stand for chunky VGA graphics unless you really needed to. So we actually had to. I actually went in and upgraded the engine myself with a little bit of help from Ray Gresko, who was the main engine developer for Dark Forces. He kind of helped me out in a few spots, but I mostly ended up just kind of trying to understand the engine enough to figure out how to double all the resolutions and get everything so that when it actually rendered the graphics, it was rendered at full 640, 480. And of course that was pushing. And the nice thing is we were writing strictly for the PowerPC. We didn't even bother doing 68040 version, as I recall. But for the PowerPC, it had enough horsepower to actually be able to do 640 by 480 graphics and run high resolution Dark Forces. And so that was a big win for the Mac at that time. And so that was one of the challenges. The big negative challenge was memory. DOS games at the time were targeting 8 megabytes, and the games would use them, but then we bring them to the Mac. In DOS, you don't really have an operating system, or you have a little tiny bit of an operating system that's a few hundred K. On the Mac, you had an operating system that took 2-3 megs of your 8 megs. And so we had to figure out how to cram a game that had the expansiveness of almost the full 8 megs on DOS to shrink it down and get it to actually run in 4.5 megs or 5 megs of memory. And so that was really the big challenge. It wasn't too bad for Full Throttle, but for Dark Forces, we experimented with a lot of things like reducing texture resolution and other kind of things. I can't even remember what we eventually settled on. But in addition to running at higher resolution, we had to compress everything down a bit to get it to go.
One bit of trickery involved using the Insane engine, or Interactive Streaming Animation Engine. This was developed for and used in games like Rebel Assault, The Dig and Full Throttle, and through compression allowed for full-screen high-quality video cutscenes.
Prior to Insane existing, all the SCUMM games wrote directly to the hardware themselves. But when they did Full Throttle, they had to integrate SCUMM with the cutscenes and with the interactive parts of the engine. And so in order to make that happen, SCUMM was sort of retargeted to not talk directly to the hardware, but instead to work. Insane had its own abstractions to talk to the hardware. They had its own video systems and own sound systems. And what they did was they took SCUMM and said, SCUMM's not going to talk directly to the hardware. SCUMM will just talk to Insane's version of the things that talk to the hardware. And so it kind of redirected all the video accesses and all the input and all the sound stuff through Insane. And so Insane was sort of like the thing that talked to the hardware. And so that kind of made it easier for me, because then I just had to port the Insane part of things, and the SCUMM stuff just kind of worked because it already talked to the hardware through Insane. So it already had that connection to the hardware there. And so that made it easier. And then when we did the Dig, Insane really didn't change much between Full Throttle and the Dig. So we were able to pretty much, that was like a super easy slam dunk port. You could, just bring the code over and recompile it, and it pretty much worked right out the gate. The goal is to not really have to understand the code, what the code's doing so much, but to provide a platform that the code can run on, or an environment that the code can run in. And so, and it helped that SCUMM, which was the majority of the Lucas games leading up to when I joined, SCUMM was already written for multiple platforms. And so the places where you needed to talk to the video hardware, which was very specific to each platform, or to the sound hardware, or to the inputs, those were already kind of isolated because they knew that that chunk would have to be rewritten for every platform, but they didn't want to have to touch the rest of the engine in order to bring it to a new platform. And so SCUMM was already well organized that way. And Insane was also written that way to begin with, because they were going to target the Mac out the gate. And so anytime you write with the idea that you might want to bring it to a new platform, you'll hopefully organize your code in a way that anything that's going to talk to the platform specific stuff is highly isolated and easy to just swap out with something else that's maybe targeting a new platform. And so when that happens, and when the code's well written, I don't really have to know how the engine works. And so, a lot of times people will come up to me, hey, you worked on those SCUMM games. Can you tell me how actors work and how shores work and the tools work? I have no idea how any of that stuff works. I have a vague idea. I'm not stupid, but at the same time, I hadn't delved into the details because I didn't need to. You know, Dark Forces was one of the few cases where I did have to dive into the details a bit because we were increasing the engine resolution. I actually had to get my hands dirty in that. But, you know, going forward from that, that was the only game where we really did any significant enhancements. Every game that I worked on after that for the Mac was really just as is, the DOS version ported to the Mac. Maybe with the graphic smoothing thing, the EPX added on top of that, but that was very easy to do as a post-processing step at the very end when you were copying the data to the screen, and so therefore it didn't really interfere with the rest of the engine at all.
Having laid the groundwork with SCUMM and Insane, porting other SCUMM games was an easier task.
Seeing how easy the dig was to get going once I'd done the full throttle work, I was like, well, you know, it bothered me that we had a gap in our things, because when there was a transition from Eric Johnston to me, Lucas had kind of dropped the adventure games in favor of focusing on getting things like Rebel Assault going. But, you know, Salmon Max and Day of the Tentacle never got Mac releases under Eric. And when I joined, the management was interested in moving forward and not looking backwards at things that had been done. So there was this gap there. And I said, well, those games look pretty neat. I wonder how hard it would be to do it. And so what I did was I actually took them and basically I got the source code of them from the developers, and I pretty much did what we did for Full Throttle, whereas I took all the video routines, and rather than having to port them to the Mac, I said, well, let's just port them to talk to Insane. Even though they don't use cutscenes, even though they don't use any of the Insane, you know, libraries for anything that's important, it can still use the video and audio hardware and input stuff. And once I did that, then it would be super easy to just bring them over on top of the same system that I already ported to the Mac. And so I did that, and literally it took me, you know, maybe a week each to get each of them up and running. And, you know, I said, well, this was so easy. Surely you can figure out some way to ship these. And marketing at first was thinking, well, we weren't planning on it, but they scrambled and they came back eventually with an idea and a plan for how to do it and where to fit it into the schedule. And so they both got formal releases, which made me super happy and actually introduced me to Day of the Tentacle, which looked like a neat game. And then I finally got a chance to play through it, debugging it and figuring it out. And it turned into probably my favorite SCUMM game.
So if you played Day of the Tentacle on Mac, you have Ahern to thank for it. An additional challenge was the Maniac Mansion Easter egg, as the full game is playable within Day of the Tentacle. This came about when discussing the limitations of the file sizes for cutscenes, and it was remarked that the entirety of Maniac Mansion had to fit within 64 kilobytes. As the Mac never got a port of Maniac Mansion, Ahern had to work out a way to get that running within the Mac version of Day of the Tentacle.
On the DOS version, all it does is it shells out and runs the real Maniac Mansion and then returns back. But on the Mac, we couldn't really launch a new program because that would present a weird thing to the user. So eventually what I did was I took the Maniac Mansion source code, which we dug out of the archives. I ported that to run on top of Insane as well, so that I also had, you know, I took all the video abstraction, targeted it toward Insane, which turned out to be an interesting thing to do for future projects. But and then I converted that code to basically a library that I could link into Day of the Tentacle. And so when you run it on the Mac, it's not launching a new program. It's just basically calling another function that's talking to the same Insane engine that Day of the Tentacle is talking to, and knows that for its hardware. And then when it exits, it just returns back to Day of the Tentacle. And so it actually worked pretty nicely the way it was set up.
Ahern ported many LucasArts games to Mac and went on to work on MAME for many years, heading up the project for 6 of them. And that concludes this little delve into the making of one of the finest point-and-click adventure games ever made. It's still as enjoyable today as it was in 1993, and its 2016 remaster is testament to that. But what is it about Day of the Tentacle that gives it such lasting appeal?
The creative spark that was specifically happening at Lucasfilm Games, you know, in those early days. Because there were other, you know, companies doing story games at the time, and I don't know that the scores from those story games have lived on as much. But I think there was something about, you know, the spark of creativity for those games. They were just so whimsical and just creative, and it inspired the music to sort of live up to that standard. And I think that's a big part of where that, longevity comes from.
I think we were lucky to be, on the scene at a time when something new was happening. And when something new happens in the culture, people, that becomes something people hang on to.
But I will say that it's certainly set the bar really high in terms of just like enjoyment of where you work and the people you're working with, because it was, I was really spoiled because the group of people and the project and the level of, just go for it, see what you can do, and then we'll give you notes, rather than like being guided so strongly to do it like exactly a specific way. And there's been variations of that throughout my career, but yeah, that was a really special way to start things out.
If I were, going to point somebody to say, I need to learn how to do puzzle design, I would point them to Day of the Tentacle.
All of Tim's games, these kind of wacky adventure games, they do have a very loyal fan base. And, because, they're so much fun and they're so creative. Tim could write anything. He could write sitcoms, he could write movies. He's just a brilliant guy.
It's exciting to hear people interested in it still. It's fun.
I'm glad that people remember Day of the Tentacle.
This whole conversation would be incomplete without referencing and calling attention to basically the culture of LucasArts, with people, with leaders, Tim Schafer and Ron Gilbert, Dave Grossman. There was a resonance, and I think it came from George Lucas. I think it came from Indiana Jones. I think it came from Star Wars to a good extent, but I think more so there was a zaniness that was just sort of, it was assumed. There was a playfulness that was assumed. Everybody, there was a kind of a wink and a nudge amongst everybody. It was almost like a secret society where everybody vibrated to the same frequency of essentially this LucasArts cultural vibe, this energy, and it had with it aesthetics. It had with it the assumption that there would be Easter eggs in games, that there would be puns, that there would be double entendres, that there would be, even in serious games, there would be some sort of satirical little inner joke or inner thing that we knew some people would get and probably most wouldn't, or whatever. There was a culture, a very strong, very integrated culture as it related to aesthetics. There were a number of companies that were real leaders at that time, but I think that LucasArts had a kind of a leadership that was in a, had all this cultural components that we talked about. And so when you combine that sort of unique perspective and the incredible subject matter of something like Day of the Tentacle, may explain why we're still hearing from people 30 years later. But whatever it was, those 90s, they were really challenging, especially the early 90s. They were really challenging and required a lot of hours and a lot of work, but it was shoulder to shoulder and teamwork and camaraderie. And I certainly haven't experienced that kind of magic since. But I've obviously had worked on great teams and continue to, but there was something about those old days.
Something about those old days indeed. Thank you very much for watching.